So we thought we'd talk to you today about some of the questions we get asked a lot about culture and tell you a little bit of the story. Elisabet and I have been working on culture for 24 years, so we thought we'd get asked a lot of questions, so let's pull that up and pull out some important ones for you. So Elisabet, how did our interest in culture start? Why don't you tell that story?
I'd love to. So Mandy and I used to work at American Express, and 24 years ago we were part of a team who had been tasked, or we've been given a mission to really help the executive team to create a workplace where people want to be. And the head of Europe, as it was, within this group, he thought this was so important that he wanted a particular team to work on it, because he said, that's what we want to have. We want people to absolutely love to be here. So our role in the team was really to be advisors to the executive team, to really look at what's going on out there, what are people experiencing, and how can we create the best possible experience for them. And then we made recommendations to them about what to do, and then we designed that and we delivered that. And it was an amazing journey, wasn't it?
It was super fun, and it lasted. It took us 3 years. So culture is one of those things that takes you time to work on and focus on, but it took 3 years, and it was incredible. And we learned so much that we've taken into our last 24 years.
Absolutely. And what happened as well, of course, is that there were so many leaders involved in this. So even though the initiative itself at one point came to an end, it had by then been absorbed by the people within the organisation and continued to live on and actually go to other organisations as well.
Yeah, and they've taken it on to their next organisations, and we work with them now. 24 years later, they're still doing it in whatever organisation they end up in. So.
Absolutely. So good fun. And that's really where our interest in this really blossomed, and we became really, really passionate about this. So, Mandy, one of the other things we often get asked is, what is culture then? You know, what is the actual definition of a culture?
Yeah, and that is a great question, and it really is, there is a great definition, which is the beliefs and values that differentiate one organisation and between one organisation and another. And you often think yourself, you've worked for different organisations, you can sort of really think about defining the culture and saying, well, what is it? And that's the way things get done around here. So how do things get done around here? And it's as simple as that. How do things get done around here? But to do that, you have to be a bit more implicit. Take the implicit and make it more explicit. So you have to pull out what is this culture really like? Explain it, describe it, be able to pull it out and really, really get underneath the covers and be able to describe it to others. So when new people come, to be able to say, this is what it is. And that takes time and that takes energy, but it is about really pulling out that and being explicit about that. Such an important thing. But it really is, that differentiates one organisation and another, and that is the differentiating factor. So who owns the culture then, Elisabet?
Well, that's another interesting question that we get a lot, and what we would say is there is always a culture. It's one of those things where whether you think about it or not, it's there. And for every organisation and for every leader, there is a choice to be made. Do I leave this to chance, or do I choose to actually take control of the culture? And the interesting thing is, whether we think about it or not, culture eats everything. You know, whether you have the best plans in the world, you have loads of strategy, you have loads of initiatives, if the culture doesn't support what you're trying to do, it's not going to work. And for that reason, everyone owns the culture, but it really starts with leaders, because leaders are ultimately the ones that are the biggest culture shapers, because they are the ones that through their behaviors and through how they interact with the organisation will, whether they think about it or not, create and shape the culture that an organisation has. So another question we often get then is, what are some examples of those culture shapers? Are there good examples and are there bad examples?
Yeah, and we see this all the time, and you'll see it every day, and it's very much something we pick up and look at, and again make it a little bit more explicit. But yeah, good and bad culture shapers. As leaders, we are the shapers of culture. So leadership is the act and art of influencing and impacting others, which in turn creates the culture at work. So a good and a bad example. So a bad example maybe is if someone says, we really want to have transparency here, and it's really important to have a transparent working environment, and then they go behind someone's back and talk about others behind their backs, which creates a little bit of cautious. People become more cautious, they get fearful, so they won't share, they won't do the transparency that is required and wanted and desired. And then you get a culture of disengagement, so you get the opposite culture. So that's an example of how a leader can simply shape a culture, and that's a bad culture shaper, if you like, as an example. A really good culture shaper is somebody who maybe says it was really important to us to have a work-life balance, so we want to create that balance and have that balance for each person. And then rather than rewarding, which we see in a bad culture shaper, rewarding, oh, it's great, they work long hours, and because they work long hours, and we're gonna reward that, which is actually not doing what they say. It's actually going around and rewarding those people who are working smarter. So encouraging that and actually pulling that out and saying we're rewarding that, which creates a culture of much more engagement and innovation, because if people can work differently, try different techniques out, then that's going to create a culture of innovation and really support that. Another great question that we get asked is, how do you get culture into the DNA? So how do you actually drive it into the core of the business?
Yeah, and the important thing to think about here is that you cannot just, create a bunch of actions or activities. There are things you can do that are on the activities side. You may, go about having workshops where you learn about something. You can put 360-degree feedback in place where leaders really understand their own impact and so on. But the activities aren't enough. So the most effective way of doing it that we've seen over all the years is where you really combine activities with behaviors, where you put the biggest emphasis on the behaviors, because it is the behaviors that shape the culture. They need to be in place as well. So it almost needs to be like two trains running side by side, one that makes sure that you do the things you say you're going to do, the activities, but the behaviors also really holding each other to account to what are we creating through our behaviors. And and there's a lot we can say about that, but we're going to leave it at that. We're happy to take questions about this if there's an opportunity for that as well later. Another question we often get is that, isn't this just a nice to have? Does it really matter with culture?
Absolutely not. It's not just a nice to have, it is an essential, and it's critical in the world that we operate in today. We're talking about, we described our story 24 years ago, but actually it's even more valid today, and it has been for the last 24 years. But high performing cultures outperform on all financial measures if you put the emphasis on it. So putting the emphasis on the culture, driving it alongside the business, doesn't mean you don't focus on the business, doesn't mean you don't focus on the bottom line. It means you are running it. It's not a nice to have, it's not, it is the job. It's not an extra thing to do, it's not another responsibility, it comes with the job, and it has to align with everything else that you're doing. So you have to be thinking about what's our strategy, what's our vision, what are our plans, what are our activities, but what's the wrapper that goes around that? Is the culture that is the glue that holds it all together.
A real enabler. Think about it, that's what we would call it, right? An enabler.
Yes, yeah.
And plans. And
as a leader, you are shaping the culture minute by minute, action by action, behaviour by behaviour. So you're driving that, and you can, each of us, every one of us can make an impact. Every one of us can link to that. So it's not just a nice to have, but it's only for those at the top. It's throughout the organisation. And a company's culture is shaped as much by the behaviours that we tolerate or overlook as the behaviours that we role model. So really think about what culture are you creating.